Going on a medieval crusade was a male mission, a military enterprise in which only men could fight. Obviously, the women stayed at home and did womanly things such as knitting and being oppressed, whilst their dashing knightly husbands rode off and defended the Holy Land. Right? Wrong. Actually, many women also took up the cross and went off on crusade, and they weren't just the important warrior noble women like Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Described as being essential yet despised, there were also the servants who looked after the animals and accompanied the army, the washerwomen, the camp-following prostitutes, and not forgetting the lice-pickers as well. Women, eh? Can't crusade with them, can't crusade without them. Welcome to medieval madness. An insufferable necessity. The Crusades were a series of holy wars that began in the late 11th century with the First Crusade, as commercial and economic growth spread across Christian Europe. The objective of the Catholic Church, which initiated and supported the religious wars, was to reconquer Jerusalem and the surrounding area from Muslim rule. During the Middle Ages, the Christian kingdoms in the north of the Iberian Peninsula, like Aragon and Leon, began to expand south into the Muslim area of Al-Andalus, while the developing merchant cities of Genoa and Pisa hassled the cities along the North African coast. In the Middle East, during the First Crusade, the Christian forces captured Jerusalem in 1099. The term crusader is a modern one. The medievals would have simply seen themselves as pilgrims defending a holy site. There were dozens of church-sanctioned military campaigns in the Middle Ages, not just against the Muslims, but against any people thought to be heretical, such as the Cathars in the south of France or the Hussites of Bohemia. There were also expeditions into Spain and the Baltic regions. Some women did go on crusade to fight. From historical evidence, we know that at least 91 women did just that between the years of 1095 and 1291 in the traditional Middle Eastern Crusades. The Muslims used the fact that these aggressive Christian women were on crusade as propaganda to demonstrate just how evil and depraved their enemy could be. Some women travelled out to the Latin East with their crusader husbands and were often seen as a burden, slowing down the journey time and using up precious supplies, but these women also completed important tasks. Those women who stayed at home may have had to find ways to financially support their crusading spouses, or take a more traditional male role of managing affairs in their husband's absence. During the First Crusade, being a washerwoman was the only role approved by the Catholic Church, with a stipulation though. The woman needed to be unattractive. It wouldn't do to have the troops in any sexual liaisons whilst they were off crusading. The soldiers were taking part in a holy war and needed to remain pure in both thought and deed. It was this sort of misogynistic medieval attitude towards women that meant that they took the blame when things didn't go well in battle, and consequently women were expelled from several campaigns. But prostitution did inevitably take place, although heavily condemned. Other female activities included acting as sutlers who sold provisions such as fish and vegetables to the army. Others were employed to pick the lice from the soldiers' heads. Albert of Aachen, a historian of the First Crusade, wrote about the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. He noted that skilled women helped to carry the materials needed to weave the panels of a siege engine. By the Fourth Crusade, which lasted for 2 years at the beginning of the 13th century, women were recognized for their contribution to the war effort and were given a share of the booty. Several nuns joined the Crusades, accompanying priests and bishops. Other women carried water to the soldiers as they marched by, and they would weep and wail, praying for the army's safe return. It's possible that some women tended to the wounded. One woman from Paris, named Magistra Hersend, appears in the records as accompanying King Louis IX of France on the 7th Crusade in 1249. As a physician, she medically attended to the king, Queen Margaret, and the camp followers. She was given a life pension of 12 pence a day for her work and loyalty. Let's go on now to meet some of the medieval women who during the Crusades took on the roles of men by looking after affairs at home or going off on their own quests. Margaret of Beverley. Known as Margaret of Jerusalem, she was born in the Holy Land sometime in the mid-12th century, while her parents were there on pilgrimage. Unlike many noble women who were wealthy enough to go on crusade, Margaret was born to English commoners. After returning to England with their daughter, Margaret's family lived in Beverley, Yorkshire, where her younger brother Thomas was born when she was 11. Margaret was left to look after Thomas when both her parents died. When he was old enough, Thomas went to work in the household of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, and became a monk at a Cistercian monastery in France. Thomas later wrote an account of his sister's life. With her younger brother now a cleric, Margaret was free to return to Jerusalem in the land of her birth. According to Thomas, she took the cross, the crusading vow, to follow Christ. There was no crusade being organized at the time of her departure, so it's possible that she went as a pilgrim. However, while she was in Jerusalem in 1187, the city was besieged by Saladin, the first Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Margaret took an active role alongside the Crusaders. It's said that she was carrying water to the soldiers when she accidentally became swept up in the fighting. Her brother Thomas reported that she tried to fashion a helmet from a cooking pot, threw weapons at the enemy, and said, quote, "Like fierce virago, I tried to play the role of a man and a woman pretending to be a man. I was terrified, but I pretended to not be afraid." Margaret was wounded in the leg and scarred by shrapnel when a millstone was thrown onto the walls. It's possible that the cooking pot story and what followed were invented. Women warriors were not acceptable, women were culturally seen as helpless and virtuous, so Margaret was given the supporting role of an auxiliary. For the medieval Christian author, especially those working for the church, writing about women fighting distracted from male crusaders, even if the woman was your sister, it seems. Jerusalem surrendered to the Muslim forces of Saladin, who, wanting to take the city with little violence, agreed to crusaders paying a ransom for their freedom. After 100,000 dinars were paid for the release of 20,000 crusaders, Margaret left the city with a group of refugees. The party was captured by Muslims, and Margaret spent 15 months as a slave and was frequently beaten. Ransomed by a Christian burgher, she was free again and made a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Margaret of Antioch, but was once again captured and enslaved. After her release, she travelled back to Europe and visited more pilgrimage sites before returning to her brother in France. Margaret became a nun, and Thomas began to write her story. She died 18 years later, sometime in the 1210s. The Unknown Nun. One nun, whose name has been lost to history, travelled to the Holy Land during the First Crusade. Initially, she left the monastery of Santa Maria and Coria in Trier, Germany, as part of the People's Crusade. This was the origin of the First Crusade, when Christians were encouraged by Pope Urban II to take up an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Peter the Hermit, who was in command of the pilgrims, had returned to Constantinople for supplies when the Muslim forces beat the disorganized Christians at the Battle of Civitot in 1096. The nun was taken prisoner and released a year later when she eloped with one of her Turkish captors. Warrior women. Many wives accompanied their husbands on the First Crusade. Gotthilda, a Norman noblewoman, was the wife of Baldwin I of Jerusalem. She died in Turkey while Baldwin was marching to Cilicia in 1097. Emmeline, who accompanied her French husband, Sir Fulcher of Bouillon, was taken to Azaz as the wife of a Turkish mercenary after her husband was beheaded at the siege of Antioch. Several women took up the cross and fought against the Muslims, some with their husbands and others without. Many of them were descended from royalty, including the most famous that we're going to look at now. Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was involved in not just one, but two crusades. Married to the King of France, Eleanor accompanied Louis VII on the Second Crusade in the mid-12th century. The Pope had called for more fighting after the Crusader state of Edessa had fallen to the great Turkoman ruler Zengi. Eleanor was a powerful woman in her own right, a huge landowner, and the Duchess of Aquitaine, the largest and richest province of France. Eleanor took the cross with her husband, and after she had recruited another 300 women in 1147, somewhere between 25 and 50,000 pilgrims and crusaders set out for the Holy Land. In Constantinople, Eleanor acted as a diplomat by exchanging letters with the Byzantine Empress, and it's from Byzantine chroniclers that we hear stories of a woman warrior dressed in full armor on horseback. It is possible that they were referring to Eleanor. The Second Crusade achieved little in the Holy Land. The king and queen fell out and divorced a few years later. Her next marriage was to Henry II of England and produced a son, Richard the Lionheart. While his mother ruled England as his regent, Richard was away fighting in the Third Crusade for the first 3 years of his reign. Margaret of Provence. Older sister to Eleanor, queen to Louis IX of France, Margaret gave birth to a son whilst on crusade in Egypt. She had accompanied her husband on the 7th Crusade, although it was the couple's first. Margaret gave birth to their son, John Tristan, in Egypt and was responsible for negotiations after her husband was taken prisoner and his brother was killed in Demeter. Louis was subsequently ransomed and released. The French chronicler Jean de Joinville described Margaret's bravery as she became the only woman ever to lead a crusade. She made sure that food continued to be supplied to the Christians in Dalmatia and persuaded crusaders who were about to leave to stay and defend the port city. She even asked the knight who guarded her bedchamber to kill both her and her newborn son if the besieged city fell to the Muslims. Countess Ida of Hainaut. Ida was married to Baldwin II, Count of Hainaut. Baldwin sold many of his possessions to take the cross and travelled to the Holy Land on the First Crusade. After the siege of Antioch in 1098, on the way to Jerusalem through Syria, Baldwin was sent to Constantinople along with one of the leaders of the crusade, Hugh of Vermandois, to request support from the Byzantine Emperor. Baldwin disappeared in Anatolia after an attack by the Seljuk Turks and was presumed dead. Ida went out to the Holy Land and arranged a search for her missing husband in Asia Minor, but both she and her husband were never seen again. Her fate remains unknown, although legend has it that Ida survived, was taken prisoner, and held in the harem of her abductor, where she bore the Muslim leader Zengi a child. Whatever their role, medieval women involved in the Crusades were making the same statement as their menfolk. They felt the need to find salvation by being holy warriors, and their presence was everywhere. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Cheers!